Well, hello, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. And welcome to the April installment of Science Communication Lunch and Learn, or SciComm Lunch and Learn. I'm Jory Weintraub, and I am a faculty member and a science communication director with the Duke Initiative for Science and Society at Duke University. And the Duke Initiative for Science and Society is the sponsor of the SciComm Lunch and Learn event. We're really delighted to have you all here today. This is a monthly series, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, in which we explore interesting, novel aspects of science communication. The goal is to have this follow sort of a science cafe format, which means we try to keep the formal presentation to a pretty short 20 or 30 minutes, and then leave a lot of time for audience engagement, questions and answers. And today we actually have a special twist on that, which I'll be talking more about in just a moment. Today's event is special, I think. First of all, it's the last event of the semester. We are going to take our traditional summer break from SciComm Lunch and Learn, and we will be back in the fall. And we've already got a great lineup of speakers for the fall, so we hope you come back in the fall and check out some of those. We also are very open to getting suggestions from all of you on potential future speakers for this Science Communication Lunch and Learn series. So if you have any ideas on that, please feel free to put them in the chat or just email me. My email address is in the chat. It's jory@duke.edu, and we'd love to get suggestions from you. But as I said, today's event's special, not just because it's the last one of the semester, but because we're introducing a new element of audience participation today, something we haven't done quite so extensively in the past. Our speaker today is Bradley Allf. Bradley's a doctoral candidate at North Carolina State University. He's both a scientist and a poet. And I've known Bradley for many years now. And when I invited him to join us to do a SciComm Lunch and Learn, to talk about science and poetry and how they interact, I thought it would be a really interesting topic. So I asked him to explore how science and poetry overlap, how we can communicate science in poetic ways, and how there's poetry in the natural and physical worlds around us. And as we were planning this session, I was struck by something Bradley said to me, and I don't know if he even remembers saying it. I'm going to paraphrase it, and I'm sure I won't do it as eloquently as he said it because he's the poet, not me. But the gist of it was that he made a comment to the effect that we are all scientists and we are all poets. And I thought that was so interesting, and it led us to this idea of not only having him talk about science and poetry, but putting out a call to all of you and inviting you to write a science poem and submit it. And then be invited to read it on the air. We were, imposed very few rules on this. We said it can be whatever you want. It can be a sonnet or a haiku or a limerick, free verse, whatever you want. And I was a little bit nervous, I have to admit, because I had that feeling like, what if you have a party and nobody shows up? I was worried we wouldn't get any submissions. And I couldn't have been more wrong about that, because we got dozens of submissions, beautiful poems. Unfortunately, more than we can possibly read today. But we did select several that I think are fantastic, and you'll be hearing from those poets in the second half of the hour today. But we're going to put their poems, as well as all the other wonderful poems that were submitted, up on a website that I will share the link with you in chat. And I encourage you to check out that website and read all of these wonderful science poetry submissions. So without further ado, I want to introduce Bradley. As I mentioned, he's currently a doctoral candidate at North Carolina State University. He's in the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology Department. He received a bachelor's degree in biology from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, with a creative writing minor, and has published extensively both in science journals and in poetry journals. He's going to spend, as I said, about a half hour today talking about his perspectives on poetry and science and the science of poetry. And then we'll hear from all of our other poets who have joined us today. So with that, I just want to thank you all for being here. Thank our scientist poets, and thank you, Bradley. And I invite you to take it away now.
Great. Thanks so much, Jory. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Great. Cool. Well, so thanks everyone for being here, and thanks again, Jory, for that introduction. I am really excited to talk to you all today about science and poetry. These are two sort of sides of my background and interests that have shaped how I think about a lot of things, and I think it can be really valuable, sort of drawing on these what might seem like disparate pursuits, things that require sort of disparate, that ask different things of you when you participate in them, but things that I think are in conversation in really interesting ways. And so I guess we'll start with why poetry. Poetry is something that some people can have strong feelings about. It can seem, elitist or something like that, and it's not restricted to non-poets. Marianne Moore famously said, I too dislike it. But I think poetry really has something interesting to say, and it asks a lot out of you, which is maybe what can stir up some strong feelings. It asks you to read it slowly. It asks you to read carefully. It usually asks you to read it out loud, at least under your breath. But your reward for that is poets' really careful attention to language. And I think reflecting on how to use language and how poets use language can be really beneficial to all of us. And so I'm talking specifically about science communication. So whether you're a science journalist, you make videos, maybe you're a science educator, I think poetry has something valuable to say to you. But I also just think it's important to have a deeper understanding of poetry just for existing in the world, because poetry has been with us for a long time. And in a lot of ways, it's the sort of the final condensation of our language. You think about the most meaningful aspects of language that we experience in our lives, vowels, prayers, historically curses. These all tend to be written in verse because the power of verse, of line, is really effective in how we talk to one another and how we communicate. And you don't have to concern yourself too much with where that sort of magic is coming from, as long as you recognize that it's there, that language can have real power. And so you can think about, the witches in Macbeth, the eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog. This is lineated. This is a piling on of image in a specific way. And what does it result in? It's a spell. And so I think just recognizing that magic, sort of like when you turn on a light switch, you're tapping into the energy of plants. At least if you get your energy from coal or gas, you're tapping into the energy of long dead plants who collected energy from light, and you're now turning that back into light. There's a real magic there that you don't have to think about the process so much as just recognizing that shift and that pattern and that sequence is there. Okay. And so talking about science communication, though, more specifically, so oftentimes when you're like me, I've attended a whole bunch of different science communication conferences and talks and seminars and workshops, and often there's a set series of things that you'll talk about in these sorts of spaces, all of which are super important. It might be how to interview, it might be how to fact check, something like that, or even like an environmental education seminar, how to teach science or about nature in specific ways. And sometimes it even borrows on, the tools of creative writing of prose, and thinking more carefully about narrative and storytelling and story arcs and characters. But poetry is often concerned with very different things than what you might be learning about in a typical like science communication seminar, but things that I think are still super important and can really improve your science communication. Because as I said, poetry is this sort of core distillation of language in meaningful and specific and evocative ways. And if you can tap into that, you can be a better communicator. And I think you can be a little bit more in tune with the world around you. And so my goal here is to sort of go through just a few, we don't have a whole lot of time, but I'm going to go through just a few different tools in the poetic toolkit, as it is. Various topics that poets are very concerned with, that we in our day-to-day lives and our use of language are probably not as familiar with, or not as specifically concerned with, but in ways that help us remember the real power that language can have. And so we're going to start with diction. And so diction is words, right? You might remember from like a high school English class or something, talking about there's sort of two sides of the coin of diction. There's the denotation of the words you choose, and also the connotation. So what the word literally means, and then also the associations that go along with that. And this is something that poets play with really intentionally, and something that I think a more careful consideration of can improve your science communication, even if you're not writing poetry. And so, okay, that's enough of me talking. Let's read a poem. And so throughout this, I've tried to choose poems and poets that are intersecting with science in interesting ways. So this is a poem by the poet Catherine Larson, who, past life was a research scientist. I think she was like a molecular biologist or something. She now teaches in an MFA program in Maine, but sort of has a background in science. And you can hear it in a lot of her writing, both in what she's writing about and also sort of how she approaches it, the analytical aspect of a scientific mind sort of playing itself out in poetry in interesting ways. And so appropriately, perhaps this is a poem about fieldwork. It's called Metamorphosis. I'm just going to read it, and then I'll put it on the screen and we can talk about it. Metamorphosis. We dredge the stream with soup strainers and separate dragonfly and damselfly nymphs, their eyes like inky bulbs, jaws snapping at the light, as if the world was full of tiny traps, each hairpin mechanism tripped for transformation, such a ricochet of appetites, insisting life, life, life against the watery dark, the tuberous reeds. Tell me, how do they survive passage? I rinse our cutlery in the stream, heat so heavy it hurts the skin, the drone of wild bees. We swim through cities buried in seawater. We watch the gods decay. We dredge the gods of other civilizations. The sun, for example, before the deity became a star, jasper scarabs excavated from the hearts of kings, daylight's blue-green water pooling at the foot of falls, sandstones where the canyon spills its verdant greens in vines, each lunar resurrection, each helix churning in the cells of a sturgeon destined for spawning, not equilibrium, but buoyancy, a hallway with 1,000 human brains carved out of crystal, quiet prisms until the sunlight hits. Great, and then let's just put this up so everyone can see it. Yeah, so this is a poem called Metamorphosis. And so we're talking about diction here, and I think this poem uses diction in some really interesting ways. And so when we think about diction with poetry, we're thinking about why the poet chose one word over another. We can think about the choice of a word like liquidate instead of melt, literally meaning quite similar things, but because of the precision and specificity required in a poem, that the choice of one of those words over another can have a big difference on the poems, how the poem feels. I guess what I'm saying is poems pay really close attention to diction. And so let's look at this poem. We see we dredge the stream with soup strainers. That's really fabulous. I can't imagine that the speaker in this poem, as they're doing this field work with the damselflies and dragonflies, is actually, maybe they are, but probably using something more high tech than a soup strainer. But really, that's all we need to know. And I sort of like the relaxed diction here, a soup strainer instead of a such and such model of water filtration device or something would feel very different for a poem like this. And you see that also in I rinse our cutlery in the stream. I imagine these are sort of the instruments that are being used to assess whatever it is that they're measuring here. But cutlery, thinking about forks and knives, seems to go along with soup strainers in an interesting way. We have these like kitchen instruments out in this hot summer in the water. These parts of the human world sort of coming in almost like apologetically coming into this very reverential place by the end of the poem, right? We swim through cities buried in seawater. We watch the gods decay. I think that's really fabulous. Imagining sort of this micro world in this stream with the dragonflies, jaws snapping at the light. That's so nice. It's so ferocious, jaws snapping in the third line. Snapping, I think, is so much better of a choice than like biting or something like that. But yeah, anyway, we sort of move towards the end of the poem, these closer reflections on almost a reverent religious aspect of this ecosystem here. And we see, gods and civilizations maybe in the rock, in the water. If you've ever looked at, a few drops of pond water under a microscope, it is a world. It is absolutely a civilization right there. The jasper scarabs, the hearts of kings. Even there's like a hierarchy here. There's a specificity of assignment of the different animals. Yeah, a lot of really great use of diction here that I think is working really well for this poem. And I think thinking about diction, more generally, some things to be thinking about in writing a poem that this poem is doing really well, and to think about in communicating in general, is we don't see a lot of cliche here, right? There's not a lot of use of language in a way that you've heard before. And poets talk about this in the idea that we live in an era of old language, right? A lot of the easiest metaphors and images have been used. They've sort of been beaten into the dirt in a way that we can't really hear them anymore and think that they're new. It doesn't click for us in the same way. There's a part later in this book by Catherine Larson where she's describing the Milky Way, right? In a sort of a more cliche approach to a description of the Milky Way. Might be Milky Way is like a white, a bright white cloud in the sky or something like that. You can't really see that because you're almost like reading through it. There's not enough there to like latch onto. And so instead of that, Catherine Larson says something like, the Milky Way sways its back across all of wind-eaten America like a dusty saddle tossed over your sable lunatic horse. And that's just like, oh, I've never been able to forget that. It's so well done. The Milky Way sways its back. I mean, that's literally, you think about the planet's rotation at night and the way that the night sky sphere sort of shifts with that rotation. And the Milky Way itself, swaying its back, it is perfect, like a saddle, a sable saddle. These are what Ezra Pound, the poet, calls the luminous details. This is what really makes a poem a poem, what makes it memorable, what makes it engaging. Poems pay attention, and in doing so, they avoid cliche, typically. Another thing to think about with diction is poems tend to have very strong nouns and verbs and many fewer modifiers, right? So you don't see a whole lot of adjectives or adverbs here, because our brains tend to sort of read through that, the tall green grass, swaying slightly, shiveringly, we sort of read through that, whereas a very strong noun and verb there, the grass shatters with the wind, something like that is much more resonant. Okay, I'm spending too much time on this, but it's such a good poem. And so now what I'm going to do is then shift to talking about some aspect of science communication that I think does diction really effectively. And it's not a poem, it's science communication, but it's borrowing these tools of poetry to make the writing and make the communication more engaging. And this, I can't promise that every time we're going to match up on topic, but this is another reflection on dragonflies, this time after they're nymphs, when they're adults. This is by Annie Dillard in a book called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, which is more nature writing probably than science, but certainly a reflection on ecology, sort of a book about Annie Dillard's backyard in Virginia. It won the Pulitzer Prize. And I'll just read this through. Nature will try anything once. That is what the signs of the insects say. No form is too gruesome, no behavior too grotesque. If you're dealing with organic compounds, then let them combine. If it works, if it quickens, set it clacking in the grass. There's always room for one more. You ain't so handsome yourself. That the insects have adapted is obvious. Their failures to adapt, however, are dazzling. It is hard to believe that nature is partial to such dim-wittedness. Howard Ensign Evans tells of dragonflies trying to lay eggs on the shining hoods of cars. Other dragonflies seem to test a surface, to learn if it's really water, by dipping the tips of their abdomens in it. At the Los Angeles La Brea tar pits, they dip their abdomens into the reeking tar and get stuck. If by tremendous effort a dragonfly frees itself, Evans reports, it is apt to repeat the maneuver. Sometimes the tar pits glitter with the dry bodies of dead dragonflies. And so here we see specific use of diction again. We probably see not so many adjectives, definitely some very strong nouns and verbs. And we see very deliberate word choice here. I love in the third line, if it works, if it quickens, set it clacking in the grass. Oh my gosh, there's something so amazing about that, because here we're sort of talking about insects broadly. And there's something for me that's really resonant about some kind of contrived device with all these bells and whistles that's been wound up and placed on the grass, and it's sort of frolicking around. It's almost like from a Studio Ghibli movie or something like that. It's one of these highly complicated devices that's maybe not doing a whole lot, and something in clacking in the grass is just fabulous there. I don't even know if clacking is a word, it might be, but it works so well right there. Failures to adapt are dazzling. Great deliberate use of language there. What else do I see? In the second to last line, by tremendous effort, a dragonfly frees itself, it is apt to repeat the maneuver. Such a nice little tongue-in-cheek, ironic twist there, but also word choice, the maneuver, right? That's a very it's a word almost from aviation. It sounds like a pilot, something they might say, which is very apt when we're talking about dragonflies, right? Yeah, very, very deliberate choice of language here. Okay, I want to make sure we get to at least one or two more. So put this back over my shoulder. So the next part of the poetic toolkit I want to talk about is simile and metaphor. And obviously all writing, all communication, can uses simile and metaphor. But I think, again, poetry's focus on specificity and deliberate choice is useful here. And you can draw some lessons from how poetry is approaching simile and metaphor. So let's start with, probably can't read this, I'll put it back full. This is a line from a poem by Tracy K. Smith, who, this is in a book that I think also won the Pulitzer Prize, actually. And Tracy K. Smith, of course, was a poet laureate until recently. This is from a poem called The Largeness We Can't See. And it's just a very simple simile here, but oh my gosh, let's just read it. When our laughter skids across the floor like beads yanked from some girl's throat, what waits where the laughter gathers? And that's the first stanza of the poem. And it's so gripping immediately. And it is really resonant. I mean, what a metaphor to think of, like beads yanked from some girl's throat. It's horrifying. It like makes me swallow when I read it because it feels uncomfortable in my mouth. And that's probably a good sign that the poet is doing something effective with their language, and you can be like viscerally affected by it. I mean, you can feel those like Mardi Gras beads almost. It's so violent in a disturbing way. And it says it in, 1, 2, 3, it's like 7 words, like beads yanked from some girl's throat. Some is an interesting choice of word there, not the girl from a girl, some girl. It's removed, and here the simile is, so what is like beads yanked from some girl's throat? Laughter skidding across the floor. I can see that in my head. It's a little bit hard to describe what exactly it is I'm feeling from this, but it's specific in a way that I get it. It feels so correct of a description here, and what a great reversal of laughter. Laughter starting quite positive, skidding across the floor. It's feeling a little more ominous, and like beads yanked from some girl's throat. That's a simile that would be hard to forget. Let's see. Okay. And now a piece of science communication that I think is using simile really well also. So this is from a story in the New Yorker called Cancer's Invasion Equation. It's deliberately choosing this. I'm, as an ecologist, particularly partial to animals and stuff. So I want to make sure we had some other kinds of science in here too. This is about cancer. I'll just read it. Cancer was thought to diffuse from its primary site like a malignant ink blot. Surgeons, believing this centrifugal theory, cancer's stain-like outward spread from a central mass, advocated ever-widening surgical extirpations to eliminate cancer. But when Paget collected the case files of 753 women who had died of breast cancer, he found a bizarre pattern of metastatic spread. The metastases didn't appear to spread centrifugally. They appeared in discrete, anatomically distant sites. And the pattern of spread was far from random. Cancers had a strange and strong preference for particular organs. Of the 300-odd metastases, Paget found 241 in the liver, 17 in the spleen, and 70 in the lungs. Enormous, empty, uncolonized steppes, anatomical land masses untouched by metastasis, stretched out in between. And there's two parts here that I think are using these comparisons with simile and metaphor really well. The first is the ink-like spread. Let me find what the second line. Cancer spreading like in a malignant ink blot, I think is so effective. Because what color is ink? Black, right? Sort of a deathly color when you're talking about things spreading within your body, which is certainly what cancer is. A malignant ink blot, with the medical word malignant, and then the more day-to-day word ink blot. I think that's really effective. And then, oh my gosh, at the very end here, enormous, empty, uncolonized steppes, anatomical land masses untouched by metastasis, stretched out in between. I love the idea of thinking about parts of your body, which is quite small, especially if you're talking about something huge like a step. I think something in that for me is really resonant. There's these huge spaces made larger by the deliberate word choice here and by the deliberate metaphor of a step, of sort of the geography of the body. Such wide spaces between where the cancer started and now where it has stretched out and spread to without touching these sort of central steps. Yeah, really great stuff there. Okay, we're running out of time here, but there's just a few more things to be thinking about. Image is another really powerful tool in the poetic toolkit. There's this great quote by Ken Burns, a documentary filmmaker. So he's also concerned with telling true stories, right? Fiction, nonfiction, which is science communication, a version of it. In a story, you could say during the Depression, 15 million people were out of work, or you could say during the Depression, in many American cities, the animals in the zoos were shot and the meat distributed to the poor. Obviously, you can really see there the value of this more specific choice of image of animals being shot to feed people from a zoo, and how outrageous that sounds. It gets at something much deeper than simply giving you the statistic, which is incredibly hard to visualize anyway. Okay, the last thing I'll say, yeah, let's end here with syntax. Another very valuable piece of the poetic toolkit. Syntax is just the order your words are in, and your choice for how those words are divided through punctuation and other means, line breaks in the case of poems. And this is super important for science communication too, because it establishes pacing, it establishes tone. And here's a poem that I think does that really well, and I think we'll end with that. Yeah, let me just read it before we look at it. So this is a poem by Ross Gay. Okay, just put it up on the screen. A small needful fact is that Eric Garner worked for some time for the Parks and Rec Horticultural Department, which means perhaps that with his very large hands, perhaps in all likelihood, he put gently into the earth some plants which, most likely, some of them, in all likelihood, continue to grow, continue to do what such plants do, like house and feed small and necessary creatures, like being pleasant to touch and smell, like converting sunlight into food, like making it easier for us to breathe. Super powerful poem here, made all the more effective by its choice of syntax, by the pacing of it. There are so many there's so much like enjambment, there's so many breaks within lines that the poem itself is all one sentence, and it sort of tumbles out in an out of breath sort of way, which obviously resonates with the theme and the subject of the poem being out of breath. And gosh, what a powerful ending. Okay, I know we need to get to other folks, which I'm super excited to see these other poems that people are writing. But just to sort of conclude here, I think poetry has something really valuable to say to science, and the nexus really of science and art more generally is something where there's a tremendous amount of value that can be tilled. And poetry specifically teaches us to reflect on language in closer ways that can help us better say what it is that we want to say. And I hope everyone now maybe is excited to go explore some science poems. And I can share this afterwards also. But if you're interested in more folks that are sort of at this interesting nexus point between science and poetry, this is an assortment of folks that are, some of them famous, some of them friends, but just a variety of folks that I've come across or have known, or that are known for being either poets interested in science or scientists with an interest in poetry. And with that, I would love to start hearing some poems from folks. So thank you.
Bradley, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. A lot to think about, some really beautiful and powerful selections. And I found that whole thing so interesting. One of the things that stood out to me early on was you were talking about all the different types of poetry around, and you mentioned cursing can be almost a form of poetry, which was a revelation to me because I've never thought of myself as a poet. And I now think that I'm freaking Whitman, because that is an area where I happen to excel. But in all seriousness, it was just really beautiful and powerful, the things you shared and the insight. So I want to thank you for that. I am now really excited to have you all hear from some of the invited poet scientists. What we did, just as a quick recap, is that we put out a call to anybody who was interested to submit their poems. We got dozens of wonderful poems, and I wish we had time to read them all, but we don't. We made some selections. It was really tough to narrow it down, but we've invited 7 people here today to introduce and read their poems, and we will get to that in one moment. I just want to say, and I put this in chat, but I want to reiterate, we've created a page on the Duke Science and Society website where we're going to be listing all the poems that you're about to hear, as well as all the poems that were submitted that we didn't have time to share today. And so I'll put that link back in chat and encourage you all to go check out all the wonderful poems we received. And if you would like to submit your own science poem and have it on that site in the future, you are more than welcome to do that as well. So we'll give you information about how to do that. So with that, I'm just going to jump right in. Our first invited poet is Hannah Edstrom. Hannah, if you could unmute and turn on your camera if you'd like to share your camera view. Hannah's a graduate student from University of Colorado at Boulder, and the poem she submitted is called Maxwellian. And Hannah, thank you for being here. Would you please quickly introduce your poem to us, tell us a little bit about it, and then go ahead and read it.
Yes, thank you. So I recently joined a bioengineering lab. I work with E. coli, but I very much enjoyed my physics classes back up undergrad. So Maxwellian is a bit of a nostalgic poem going over a little bit of what I had learned sitting in the classroom and Maxwell's equations. Maxwellian, the fresh chalk squeaks, and from the yellow cloud emerge a code of ancient origin, a partial differential integration depending on your need. Here let the loud rustling of papers, pencils scribble down, each step, each derivation with a spin of wrist to capture deltas, curves of Grecian past, some annotations etch around, the Gaussian, a charge or dipole's field, magnetic loop or flow from positivity. Then Faraday, each moving magnet makes a field flowing, electric sparks at play. With Ampere, forces self-sustaining flight, in time and space will iridesce as light.
Awesome. Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, that was really, really lovely and sort of demonstrative of like there's like jargon there, which in science communication often you're told to like stay away from. But in a poetry, when you can be concerned even with just the sounds of words, almost freed a little bit to play a little more fast and loose with the language in that regard. And I love that there's so many interesting images that are conjured, even if I don't understand, what a dipole is, or I can't quite remember. Yeah, super effective. And it's a sonnet. I love sonnets. So thanks, Hannah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hannah. That was terrific. All right, we're going to move on to our next poet, Madison Jones. Madison, if you could unmute, turn your camera on, that'd be great. Madison is an assistant professor of writing and rhetoric and natural resources at the University of Rhode Island. And the poem that he submitted is called Prescribed Burn. So Madison, would you like to tell us a little bit about this poem?
Thanks so much, Jory. This poem was written during my doctoral research. I would often take a break from writing to ride my bicycle down this long bike trail that went through the swamps in Gainesville, Florida. And you'd often encounter things like gators or bobcats along the trail. But one of the oddest things that I would come into contact with were researchers doing controlled burns out in the swamp. It was a really just sort of odd scene to come across when you're on a bike path. So that inspired this poem. Prescribed burn. Below the trail, we see the white fuel tanks. Through the cloud of smoke that makes the flames they cast seem dull. The ranger in her white fire suit looks Martian-esque against this strange landscape of green and char behind where she walks. Waves of flame spread and smolder, the leaf litter like breakers on the shoreline. A tame blaze born out of the steady flow of gasoline and a spark, disciplined by fire breaks plowed into the darkening earth. The ranger walks her sacred labyrinth in reverse, a god birthing phlegethon behind her as she moves outward toward the perimeter of tilled dirt, the tattoo of scorched ground and hand lines spelling boundaries to veil the illusion of management and control. A remedy born out of its own poison, her careful retreat from its advancing line, leaving the landscape charred and impotent, fighting wildfire with restrained flame. Scorching the fuel, the saw palm becomes an offering against the day when feral flames might sweep wild as mad dogs through protected taproot and loam. Thank you.
That's great. Awesome. Thanks, Madison. And wow, this poem is in such great conversation with Catherine Larson's poem that we read at the start. This sort of the reverence there and the religiosity almost, and the ritual of, in this case, doing a controlled burn, and so many awesome images there. I love the sort of the shrouded figure, the dressed in white, almost like a priest that's performing the prescribed burn. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that too. And I felt like the language was so effective at conveying sort of the violence of this, that it's an intended, it's prescribed, right? It's intentional, and yet there's sort of this destructiveness and this violence to it that I thought was conveyed really nicely with the language that he used. Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, and moving right along, because I want to make sure we have 4 more, and we want to give everyone a chance to read theirs. Next, I'm going to invite Juliet Crowell to unmute, turn on her camera if she's willing to. Juliet is an education and outreach manager at the University of Chicago. And she, I thought we would get a lot of haiku submissions. We got only one, and it was from Juliet, and it was selected. So Juliet, please tell us about the haiku and read it to us if you would.
Well, thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
I'm so excited to be here. This is my haiku. It's up on the screen for those of you that have your camera on. Planted in the snow, window to the universe, birth of galaxies explode. And so I would love to hear in the chat what you think is planted in the snow, or what you believe to be the window to the universe. So I do, and so that would help you define what I do. And so I love this because people always ask me what I do or what kinds of science education I support. And so it's also a form of sort of an elevator speech. And while the syllables for the haiku are normally 5, 7, 5, I would have had to stop at birth of galaxies. And I think that does the tremendous amount of galaxies that are discovered all the time, such injustice. So I added the word explode. And so when you think about the Big Bang Theory, and when you think about the explosive nature, and also the excitement of this work, that was a very appropriate word. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see if we got any answers in the chat.
Yes, you got several.
Telescope feet, exactly. So we think about telescopes that explore the universe or map the sky. We think about the Hubble, and this is planted, this telescope. I work with telescope scientists and researchers that are in Antarctica. So planted piece is the telescopes that they put there, and the windows of the universe, which could have also been, of course, eyes, because they're using telescope camera lenses. And so I work on education and public outreach with the astronomy and astrophysics department at the University of Chicago. And my whole career, I've worked with content experts and finding ways to communicate that to the public and get them excited and engaged about science. Thank you for your time.
That's so wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with us and the backstory on it as well. Bradley?
Yeah, I really love that. And I think the haiku in general is a form that can demonstrate how powerful poetry can be, even very briefly, to create really wonderful images. And I love here sort of the repetition almost in the first and third lines of repeating this idea of birth. This thing is getting planted in the ground, and then at the same time, the galaxies are being born. Some great work going on there. So thanks, Juliet.
Absolutely, thank you. Moving right along, our next poet is Elliot Greiner. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, Elliot Greiner, who's a graduate student at University of Michigan, and his submission is titled Rain. So Elliot, please take it away.
Yeah, you pronounced it perfectly. My poem is more of an imagined scene that I hope can follow along with. Rain. It shimmers the forest, pushing leaves to dance and birds to hide. What comes hasn't for weeks, like a trick of the morning, and seeps coolly into patient roots, pearled, a brief shiver of glass. The book I ask little of it, the cedar more, but neither as much as the oak, thick and broad and pale-leaved in the low light. It hides a raccoon in its branches, bowing gently as she squirms, negotiating dryness with grip, and considers the slick dark hollow above her. To a distant eye, she might look like rot on the trunk, but then she moves, swinging a tail, the orange-breasted robin in her teeth. It's all she could manage after the creek overflowed and the scent trails went cold with petrichor, yet it is enough. In time, the damp will rise, warm and higher than most ever see, condensing wide into heaven as the sky returns, and the robin is left to the raccoon to her oak, the oak to its roots. And then the world will dry and wait. And that's it.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Elliot. I'm loving hearing these like people at the intersection of science and poetry reading poems. I mean, petrichor, I love it. Some great use of effective jargon. I love some of the images in there. Shiver of glass is so perfect. The verb and the noun both contributing to the sense of like being delicate, of the fragileness of the habitat where the speaker is. So, yeah, great stuff.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much, Elliot. Our next poet is also from University of Michigan, an undergraduate student, Madeline Bacalor. Madeline, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right. And Madeline's poem is Ode to the Limpet. And I just want to mention here as someone who teaches college students that how much I love the fact that not only did she submit a wonderful poem, but she actually had appropriate footnotes and references in her poem. So she gets bonus points for that. So Madeline, if you're there, please unmute, turn on your camera if you'd like to, and read Ode to the Limpet.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I read this great article by Jonathan Webb, which, as Jared mentioned, is in the citations in the poem, called Limpet Sets New Strength Record. They have these crazy teeth, so I would definitely look into that article for more information. But this is Ode to the Limpet after Percy Shelley. Oh, tiny limpet, you of conical shell, a frozen firework, a starburst in stone. O you, variegated sand creature, cast in carbonate, held fast until the tide comes in. When waves again cover your rocky pool coast, you're a flurry of motion, scraping, on the hunt. O you of algal carnage, your teeth, a conveyor, or your tongue, a conveyor belt of teeth, stronger than Kevlar. O you, bulldozers of the seashore, levers of slimy roadmaps to follow when the tide ebbs. Return to your home scar, the indentation worn into rock by your travels. O tiny limpet, hold fast. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Bradley.
Yeah, thanks so much, Madeline. Algal carnage, fabulous. Some great use of syntax here too. Some interesting like rearrangements of the subject and object on the line that I thought was interesting. I wish we had time to like really get in depth on everyone's poems. I think we have one more.
We do.
Thanks
One
everyone for
more.
reading.
We have 2 minutes. I know that some people may need to leave right on the hour, and if you do, that's fine. We understand. If you can stick around for another minute or two just to hear our final poem, that would be terrific. Corey Bunce is a grad student at Duke University. And Corey, if you're there, please unmute and turn on your camera if you'd like to. He's going to introduce and share with us The Laboratory Mouse, Stages of Development.
Yeah, thanks, Jory. So I do research on developmental biology in the mouse, studying mostly how cells get together to form organs. In my life, I did a lot of art before doing science, so I'm always wondering how that impacts the way I do science. And in writing this poem, I was trying to reflect on sort of the relationship between how I learned to engage with sort of forms of communication in art and science, and then also how I engage with nature itself in my research. So it is the laboratory mouse, stages of development. The story of a mouse in fusion starts, and once upon a zygote cleaved and try, by ebbing, flowing dialogue of parts, the sets sequester, players multiply. In scenes that breathe like lungs and beat like hearts, diversely scripted characters supply the props and cues of biochemic arts, and so the mouse develops, cute and shy. How strange that mice unfold in forms I used to critically dissect, and that despite an author's evidence, they're disabused of all improvisation by my sight. But I remember well what Barth's accused, that much as nature reads her mouse, I write. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Corey. As a person who is an immunologist in my past life, I've spent a lot of time with mice, so that one hits near and dear to my heart as well. Bradley, do you have anything to say about Corey's poem?
Yeah, just that, man, I could read books about on the poetry of developmental biology. There's just so much magic. I mean, talking about spells and magic and how things cleave and divide and are created in cauldrons and broths. But there's so much great imagery there and so much magic, and you did a great job with that. Yeah, thanks, Corey.
Thank you. Yeah, so unfortunately we're a minute over. I need to wrap this up, but I want to start by thanking all of our amazing poets for just a beautiful job, and thank them for taking their time to come on and share their poems with us. As I mentioned, all of the poems you heard, plus all of the other ones that were submitted that we didn't have time to read, are going to be on the Duke Science and Society website, and I've posted that link several times in chat. You could always just email me directly, jory@duke.edu, and I can direct you to that. I also really want to thank Bradley Allf for being here today, for being an inspiration for this event. It was such a fun way to end this semester's run of science communication lunch and learn sessions. As I said, we're going to take our summer break. We will be back in the fall. We've already got some really wonderful speakers lined up, so we hope to see all of you again in the fall. Thanks everybody for sticking around a few minutes extra, staying late, and thanks for being here. And thanks, Bradley and our poets. You were wonderful.
Yeah, thanks everyone for reading. That was great.
Have a good day, everyone.